right, good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome everybody to the Atlantic States Marine Fishery Commission's Striped Bass Management Board. My name's Marty Gary. I'm with the Potomac River Fisheries Commission. I'll be your board chair. Our vice chair is Megan Ware from the state of Maine. I'm joined at the front table by our fishery management plan coordinator, Emily Franca, and also our ASMFC science lead, Dr. Katie Drew. And also to my left is our law enforcement liaison, Jeff Mercer from Rhode Island. Nicole Languel Costa is our technical committee chair, and Lou Bassano is our AP chair. So just want to acknowledge one not new board member, although it's listed here, not new to all the folks in the room, but in Joe Cimino's stead from New Jersey, Jeff Rust is the administrative proxy. So welcome to the board, Jeff. And our first order of business is approval of the agenda. So I would ask, are there any additions or modifications to the agenda? Seeing none, the agenda is approved by consent. Next up are the approval of the proceedings from January 2023. Are there any edits to the proceedings from January 23? Seeing none, the proceedings are approved by consent. Next up is public comment. So I will be looking for items that the public would like to comment that are not on the agenda. We'll look for raised hands in the room and also ask staff to look on the webinar if they have anybody has their hand raised. So items not on the agenda, the public would like to make comment on. Not seeing any hands in the room, any on the webinar. So I'd ask one more time, is anyone on the webinar would like to make comment on items that are not on the agenda? Okay, no hands up. So we're going to move on to item number 4 on our agenda.
Josh, raise your hand for me. Okay, you're just self-muted, Josh.
Everything went quiet. Sorry about that.
There we go. No worries.
All right.
All right, Josh, thank you. You're back and we hear you. So take it away.
All right. Thanks. Sorry about that. All right. Do you guys have the presentation up? I'm only seeing the webinar slide.
Yep, we're working on it, Josh. If you want to start, it's okay. And
Sure.
There you go.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks, everybody. Yeah, I'm Josh Newhart. I work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and I actually maintain our cooperative tagging program database. So I'll be giving a brief overview of the overall tagging program. I'll talk about our offshore winter tagging and get into, some of the things that we've faced, some of the history of it, some of the challenges that we've dealt with, and just give you all an update. So if you want to go on the next slide. So the tagging program began actually in 1985 as part of striped bass management, and that was in response to the passing of the Atlantic Striped Bass Conservation Act. So as I mentioned, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service maintains the database. We distribute all the tags to state agencies, and then we receive all those tag returns that come in from the public who catch and either harvest the fish or let it go, all that stuff. The state agencies tag the fish along the Atlantic coast, typically as part of their routine monitoring, usually for adults. We currently have 9 agency programs that are actively tagging. Those are further broken down into what I'll refer to as producer areas and coastal areas. So producer areas are those programs that tag fish during the spawning migrations within specific reaches of striped bass spawning habitat. And then coastal area programs tag what are assumed to be mixed stock fish during the fall, winter, or early spring before they make their spawning migration. Next slide. So the current producer area tagging programs are New York Department of Environmental Conservation that tags in the Hudson River. We have 3 that tag in the Delaware Bay or Delaware River population. Those are Delaware, Pennsylvania Fish and Boat, and New Jersey DEP. And then there's 3 programs that tag in the Chesapeake Bay. So that's Maryland DNR, Virginia. Virginia Institute of Marine Science actually does their tagging, and DC Fisheries. And then coastal tagging programs, we actually have 4. So Massachusetts tags in the fall in the offshore waters off Massachusetts. New Jersey DEP is also considered a coastal tagging program. They have some sites that are lower in the Delaware Bay, and they tag in early spring, so that's still considered some mixed stock fisheries. And New York DEC does fall tagging off the Long Island coast. And then for the bulk of this talk, I'll be talking about the NC Co-op, or that's the North Carolina Cooperative Tagging Program. That's our offshore mid-Atlantic tagging of striped bass in the winter, where we're presumably targeting, all the mixed stocks, mixed coastal stock fish. And that's been a long time partnership between North Carolina Division of Marine Fisheries, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Maryland DNR and NIMS, and ASMFC. That's the next slide. So overall, all tagging programs through 2021 have tagged just over 558,000 fish. And that's we've had a little bit over 89,000 tag returns. So that gives us an overall recapture rate of about 16%. If you look at just individual unique fish that have been recaptured, that's about 15.5%. So you can see that, there's a handful of fish that in the database that have been recaptured multiple times. So the way these tags work, just as a brief refresher, is there is a number on the outside of the fish. They're inserted through a small incision in the belly. So an angler could actually cut that tag off, report it to us, let that fish go, and then if it gets reported again and it gets harvested, then the button that sits under the skin of the fish has all the same tag information, so then we can again get that information. Next slide. So just a brief overview of how the data has historically been used in stock assessments. It is part of the stock assessment process. There is even a tagging subcommittee. The main thing the tagging data has been used for is to estimate fishing and natural mortality in order to compare those estimates with the statistical catch-at-age assessment model. It is also part of current efforts to develop a more spatially explicit multi-stock model. And in the last benchmark stock assessment, it was looked at for the tagging data was used to estimate relative stock composition. Ended up only being, I think, used for fish that were over 28 inches or 711 millimeters. You'll see that come up again later. So that's typically the cutoff for, what we'll call large coastal migratory fish. And it's also can be looked at for migration rates and residence time as well. Next slide. So if we just look at the history of the North Carolina Cooperative Tagging Program, it is designed to target overwintering striped bass offshore of North Carolina. The trawl survey actually began in 1988. And initially it was really designed to hopefully be an index of abundance, offshore index of abundance for striped bass. And that did change over time, but the trawl survey did continue through 2016. However, there were no trawls in 2011, 12, or 2014. So at that time, those were mainly related to funding. So I don't remember exactly, but anyway, the funding, started to become difficult to acquire. So beginning in 2011, hook and line fishing surveys were sought as a potential option. It wanted to be explored, and really with the idea being that they would be done alongside the trawl. There was really no intent to end the trawl. It just became that funding was difficult. And as you can see here, one of the reasons for that is it's about 100 to 160,000 for a trawl vessel use for 10 days, a 10-day cruise. And that doesn't even include all the agency personnel time that is, essentially donated in kind. For hook and line, for 10 plus hook and line charter trips, we're usually in the ballpark of 20 to 30,000. We've seen that increase in recent years as fuel's gotten more expensive. The other benefit or advantage of hook and line fishing is that we can be really efficient with our trips. If it's bad weather, we don't have to go out. With the trawl, you usually pick in a 10-day block of time, and you're out there. You still have to pay for that vessel time, even if you have to, run to port or something like that. So, next slide. So here's the distribution. Don't get too caught up in all the points. Hook and line points are triangles, and trawl points are just circles. And they're both color coded from with the oldest year of the survey being green, going to most recent survey in orange and red. And really, I just want to show you how the surveys kind of change over time. The trawl surveys were historically done right offshore North Carolina, typically within the 3-mile limit, almost always within sight of shore. And you can see, there's even some points there south of Cape Hatteras on the Outer Banks. In the later years of the trawl, in 2016, they actually had to enter Maryland waters for the first time. So the hook and line survey is always historically always been based out of Virginia Beach. So you can see all the distribution of points out there. And you can see with the trawl survey, there's some points off the mouth of the bay, as well as the hook and line survey. Those points are significantly farther offshore than some of the historic trawl survey data. So fish have kind of been further offshore and a little bit further north, to the point where we don't even really fish in North Carolina waters much anymore. And in fact, if you look at this year, 2023 hook and line survey was actually right off the mouth of the Delaware Bay, and almost exclusively off of Delaware. So that was the first year for that. In 2021, all the surveys were conducted out of Ocean City, Maryland as well, just like this year. But we mostly stayed off of Maryland waters that year. All right, I can go to the next slide. So we just look at a number of tagged fish just by NC Co-op, both trawl and hook and line over time. You can see that in the early 2000s, it was kind of what we call the heyday of the trawl. I mean, there was a lot of fish tagged. You can see the peak of over 6,000 fish in the year 2000. But really, in that time frame was between 2,000 and 6,000 fish. And I know that kind of corresponds well to kind of the peak in the stock assessment, if I'm correct there. But if you look in some of these later years with hook and line, we've been around the average of about 1,000. I'll get more into that data in a second. But if you look at the years where we did both the trawl and hook and line, now hook and line did catch or tag more fish. So 2013, there's about 2,000 fish tagged, and a little bit more than 1,000 were tagged using hook and line. And then 15 and 16, hook and line, significantly outperformed the trawl survey as well. Without getting into all the details of what happened on those trawls. But you can see it fluctuates. 2011 and 12, again, remember, there was no trawl surveys done that year, and we only conducted one hook and line trip that year. That was kind of just the first go at it. The next slide. So in these next few slides, you'll see kind of some similar graphs, and this is just to show the relative contribution of NC Co-op tagging program versus kind of all other tagging programs. So if we look at all tagged fish, and then we just look at the last 10-year average, which is all hook and line, the NC Co-op program has been around 17% of all the tags that are in our database. So all tagging programs, coastal and producer. You can see, obviously, that fluctuates all over the place, especially those years, 2011 and 12, where we don't have much sample size there. That's what those asterisks are for, just to remind you that those are the years with just one hook and line survey and no trawl survey. So if you want to go to the next slide, we'll break it down a little bit more. If we look at all large fish, all tagged fish that are greater than 711 millimeters or 28 inches, then we can see the contribution of the NC Co-op fish raises up to a 10-year average of about 39%. I will say that 2022 point, that's just a hair over 50%. That'll come down a little bit. I'm still waiting on a couple coastal tagging programs data. But you can see that it is providing a fairly robust sample size of all the tagged fish of these large, presumably migratory fish. So if we break it down even further on the next slide, that if we look at all coastal tagged fish that are greater than 711 millimeters, then it's a really large contribution. Most of these tags in our database are coming from the NC Co-op tagging program. With that, I took off the 2022 here. And if we look at the 9-year hook and line average, it's 2/3 of all the large coastal tagged fish in the database. So you can go to the next slide. And here's just the raw numbers. You can look at the number of trips, number of fish caught, and number of fish tagged. So we're really conservative on these cruises about if there's any kind of bleeding or the fish doesn't look healthy, we're not going to tag it. So, we're tagging probably 99% of everything that comes on board, but we just like to be really conservative with what does come on board. So if you look at the overall history of the hook and line survey, we've averaged about 650 fish tagged per year. Now, if you exclude those first 2 years where we only did 1 trip a year, it's about a 750 average. And really, that's kind of the ballpark that, at least in my head, when we're coordinating these, if we can average about 100 fish a day, then that's great, and that we can kind of reach that longer term average. So we're gonna go to the next slide. So really, it has been proven, I think, to be a nice, viable, cheaper option than the trawl survey. And as I said, we can be more efficient with our time. It might be a little bit of a headache in scheduling and cancellations and things like that, but at least we can go out on good days and try to set ourselves up to have success. It does still provide a majority of the tagging data on coastal fish, especially the large migratory fish. Again, the bulk of that data in our database is coming from this tagging program. We do have sampling challenges as these fish have moved further and further offshore and further north. We're just one boat out there in a lot of water, so it can be tough to find them. And then, of course, the furthest that we'll go is 30-35 miles offshore. So we're getting pretty far out there, but we're not going to go much further than that because these are just day trips. So we still have to make it back in decent time anyway. We are facing some funding challenges. There's no long-term funding source. So North Carolina paid for it for a number of years. I believe they stopped in 16 or 17. I'm not positive on that end, but it's been, since they stopped paying for it, it's been a cobbling of some Fish and Wildlife Service funds, some ASMFC funds, and currently we don't have secured funding to conduct sampling in 2024. We are having some internal discussions, in-house, and I think there's also some going on elsewhere that, we're looking for it, but we don't have anything secured officially right now. So apart from that, that's kind of the challenges that we've been facing. And with that, I think I can move on to the next slide, but I just want to take a brief second to acknowledge, the fishing vessel Midnight Sun, Captain Ryan Rogers and the crew for conducting this for a number of years, keeping all our crew safe. The hundreds, if not thousands, of volunteer anglers. This is all volunteer anglers. We, sign people up to go fish and help us reel in the fish. Crew brings them on board, biologists tag them, and off they go. And I will say it's really efficient. I've clocked it at, sometimes the fish comes on board and 30 seconds later, it's over the side back in the water. So, we'll hold fish in a live well if we have to, but when things are going smoothly at a nice, comfortable pace, it's really efficient in that as well. And also all the agency personnel for their staff time. This is all, again, this is a big partnership. Biologists from all different agencies are helping out. So I just want to thank all of them. And with that, I can take any questions.
Thank you, Josh, and great presentation. And we've obviously learned a lot over the years since the late 80s with the trawl survey in the winter off North Carolina and seeing these fish move further north offshore. We've talked before at previous meetings about the value of this data. And I know I have questions about the funding and hope we have a little bit of a discussion about that. I'd like to see, hopefully we have continuity here with this survey, but I'll open it up to questions for Josh for now. Eric Reed.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I like to talk about funding too. I mean, it sounds like this is a really valuable program, and it would be a shame to have a shortfall in funding this. So I see that ASMFC and somebody else is doing the financing. I mean, what's the holdup to get funding for 2024? I know it's money, Bob. Sorry about that, but it's a great way to start the conversation this morning. Let's talk about money just for fun, But anyway, what do we got to do to secure this for 1 year or longer?
Thanks, Eric. Bob?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah,
So the survey's been funded through a variety of sources over the years, directly from NOAA Fisheries for a while, then U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has done it for the last few years. And there's a question whether U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service will have the money for the next year, is where we are. You know, as you saw up there, it's only $20,000 to $30,000. It's not a lot of money. The commission might have that money available in a contingency fund. However, the money that we might be able to tap into hasn't been cleared, doesn't have the NEPA clearance to do on the water research activities. It's money that we get through the Atlantic Coastal Act to do meetings and buy equipment and that sort of thing. So there, you know, things where there's, you know, no environmental impact. So we would have to get, we'd have to do some paperwork and see if we can get that cleared to fund this survey. So we're willing to do that, but if Fish and Wildlife Service comes up with a funding source, that would be great as well. So, you know, there are some options here. We just have to work through them. But it's, again, not a lot of money, but it may be more work than money to get it. You know what I mean? It may be a workload and a clearance issue more than a money issue. But I agree with what you said, Mr. Reed. That's an important survey, and we don't want a lapse in that survey.
All right, we have two members of the board, Pat Gear and Tom Fody. We'll go to Pat first.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It doesn't seem like it's a lot of money, but, and I understand the work behind the NEPA process. So would anybody consider putting in a multi-year grant project for this instead of just doing it 1 year at a time? You know, it's not a lot. It's not a lot of money. And then the NEPA process would only have to be done once instead of every single year. So, I mean, like, you could probably put in a 3-year project for this. So we're not going through this every year. You know, Wilson Laney had to go through this for years, every year coming and looking for money. And it's like, it seems like if it's important, and this is not very much money, try to identify a source of funding for 3 years at a time. No.
Thank you, Pat. Tom?
Since we're going to have a heavy day, I'll suggest that we have a virtual meeting on the water as they're fishing, so it's covered under the meetings.
I like your suggestion, Pat, and maybe I can talk to staff and we can see what we can do on the side. There is one member of the public that I think has a question for you, Josh. This would be Mike Abdal. Mike?
And go ahead, Mike Abdal. Looks like you're just muted on your end. And Mike, if you just click that microphone button, you should be able to unmute yourself if you have a question. All right, Mike, looks like we can't hear you. So I'll turn it back to the chair.
All right, Eric.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. So the boat that does the survey, what is that, like a 12-pack or I counted more than 6 people, so I'm thinking maybe it's more than a 6-pack. But that's a for-hire vessel?
Correct. Yeah, it's whoever the funding agency is, you know, puts out the bid, and it's been about a 52-foot boat.
All right, so they can carry passengers for hire. So since you have hundreds or thousands of people who are willing to go fishing, would they be willing to pay to go fishing to augment the survey?
That might not be a question for me. We've had people, you know, people want to help out, but, you know, in terms of us taking money, I don't think that's going to happen on the Fish and Wildlife Service end, but, you know, taking money from the public.
Well, the only thing I'd say there is from my experience going out with the Midnight Sun, it's been a good opportunity for the fishery managers, biologists to mix with some of our stakeholders and other folks. It's great to have conversations out there. So that's just an added benefit to it. But I think this has been a good conversation and appreciate the board's interest in continuing this. And so I'll try to work with staff to see what we can come up with to help keep this going. Josh, thank you so much for your presentation today and appreciate all your hard work and all the folks at U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that work on this survey. Thank you.
All right, thanks.
All right, we're going to move on to item number 5 on our agenda. It's a technical committee report. The technical committee report will be provided by our stock assessment subcommittee chair, Mike Celestino, who's on the webinar. The TC report covers two issues, the 2022 removals and commercial quota utilization related to draft addendum 1 on quota transfers. And following the presentation, Mike's presentation, we'll take questions first. Please, only questions. Mike, you're on the webinar. Are you ready to go?
Yes, thank you. Just need another second to pull up my slides on my end. Okay, thank you. Yeah, I guess I would like to just start by acknowledging Gary Nelson, who put together hundreds of lines of code for us to be able to complete these tasks. I also want to acknowledge commission staff, Katie and Emily. They always bring a ton of support to help with these tasks as well and with this presentation. I also want to acknowledge the TC and SAS for some really thoughtful discussion as we worked our way through these tasks as well. Next slide, please. So the Striped Bass, TC, and SAS met in March of 2023 to talk about the two things that the chair just mentioned. So one of the things we talked about was to review some corrections to rebuilding probabilities that appeared in the stock assessment update report that we showed last year, and the other was to address some updated stock rebuilding projections as tasked by the management board over the last 1 or 2 meetings. Next slide, please. In terms of the correction to the 2022 assessment update, so in that assessment document, we provided some short-term projections with probabilities of rebuilding SSB to various levels, thresholds, and targets under several different constant F scenarios. So we looked at F status quo, F threshold, and F target. It turned out that standard error was inadvertently used in the error calculations where we had intended to use the coefficient of variation. That inadvertent swap didn't affect the median projection. So if you think back to the projections you saw, there's sort of a solid line with some error bars around it. It wouldn't have affected that median projection, but it did affect the width of the error bars. And so those error bars actually became a little narrower. And so we've provided those in the updated table in the memo. We have the table appended to this presentation if folks would like to see that again as well. And we'll update that information in the assessment document as well. Next slide, please. So for the rebuilding projections, we had two specific tasks. One was to evaluate whether the 2022 removals remained at a level consistent with our expectation from the previous round of projections. Task 2 was to conduct stock projections to determine how the ocean commercial quota utilization scenarios could impact the stock rebuilding timeline. Just as a reminder, the board had requested projections in time for today's meeting and had also requested inclusion of the 2022 preliminary removals in order to meet this deadline. Next slide, please. So to talk a little bit about some of the data inputs, the projections use the 2022 assessment model configuration, including the low recruitment assumption. And just as a reminder, that low recruitment assumption means that we're restricting draws of recruitment in between the years of 2008 and 2021. We had some information, some exploratory analyses show a really strong relationship between the Maryland YOY index and the model-based estimates of recruitment. And so since we had estimates of the Maryland YOY index for 2021 and 2022, we could use those to inform our estimates of recruitment in 2022 and 2023, respectively. So the TC and SAS thought that those would provide better predictions of recruitment rather than just random draws for those first early years of the projection. Next slide, please. Some additional information on data inputs. So all the scenarios, again, they're using preliminary 2022 removals in numbers of fish. We're using 2022 commercial landings from each state. We're using estimated commercial dead discards using the ratio of discard to landings ratios from the previous year. And we're using, and just as a reminder, those dead commercial discards account for a very small fraction of the total removal. So this is a source of uncertainty, but a very small source of uncertainty. And we're also using the 2022 MRIP estimates for recreational harvest and dead releases as well. To talk a little bit about some of the MRIP results, the estimates indicated a 40% increase in total removals relative to the previous year. We saw an almost doubling in recreational harvest and a much more modest increase in live releases, about a 3% increase in live releases. And combining both sectors, the commercial and the recreational sectors, we saw a 33% increase in total removals relative to the previous year. Next slide, please. Some of you may have seen that the final MRIP estimates were released just last Wednesday. We saw very minor differences between the preliminary estimates and the final estimates. The final recreational removals estimate is 1% lower than the preliminary estimate. That those results haven't been incorporated into this presentation and slides and so forth. There wasn't time to incorporate those changes. The point we wanted to make is just that it's a very modest change relative to the exercise we worked through. Next slide, please. A little more detail on some of the data inputs. So for the ocean quota utilization scenarios, we had to make some assumptions. We assumed that there would be the additional harvest starting in 2023 to reflect using either all or most of the ocean quota. And this is in direct response to the board task. And to wade into some of the details of scenario 2, this is the scenario where we're assuming full ocean quota is used. The unused 2022 ocean quota is converted from pounds to number of fish and then added to the total removals. The next 2 bullets just go through some detail that I can comment on if there's questions. And then the last scenario, scenario 3, this is assuming that the full ocean quota is used except for New Jersey starting in 2023. So we followed the same procedure as the previous bullet, except we're now subtracting New Jersey's quota from that additional harvest. And the idea here is that this reflects the idea that New Jersey's commercial quota is unavailable for a transfer since it has historically been reallocated to the recreational fishery. Next slide, please. To talk through some of the projection scenarios. So the TC and assessment committees focused on 3 scenarios, assuming a constant 3-year average fishing mortality through 2029. This 3-year average fishing mortality acknowledged that catch and fishing mortality can vary from year to year, even under the same regulations. The 3-year average F was very similar to fishing mortality in 2022. Though we did work through a set of exploratory runs just to evaluate projecting F 2022, and the results were almost identical to the results we're showing in the memo. In scenario 1, this is essentially the status quo scenario. It's based entirely on just 2022 removals only. We're using, like I mentioned, a 3-year average F, and in this case, we're using an average F from 2019, 21, and 22. We are specifically excluding 2020 due to some COVID-19 uncertainty. And then for scenarios 2 and 3, we have a different set of assumptions. One, we're applying ocean commercial quota starting in 2023. We're also assuming a constant or at least fixed removals between 2022 and 2023, and then constant F from 2023 through 2029. I'll talk about the implication of that in some subsequent slides. And in this case, scenarios 2 and 3, the average F is now 2019, 2021, and 2023. So this next slide largely reiterates the information I just mentioned, so I won't repeat everything, but it is a good reminder for me to draw just a few additional points. So scenario 1, again, is essentially status quo, where we're not, the additional commercial quota is not available for harvest. Scenario 2, where this is the full ocean quota utilization. This is bringing an extra 41,000 fish. This is an extra 41,000 fish on top of 6.9 removals, so it's a very small fraction of fish, or it's a very small fraction relative to total removals. And there is some double counting because of New Jersey's bonus program. In the interest of time, I'll just say that double counting is probably around 5,000 fish or so, and I can answer questions on that at the end if there are any. And then finally, for scenario 3, we're now adding just an additional 27,000 fish on top of roughly 6.9 million removals. So again, a very small, modest amount of additional fish. Next slide, please. So on to the results. So for all the scenarios, the projected F rates were between the current fishing mortality target of 0.17 and the fishing mortality threshold of 0.2. And this contrasts with the fishing mortality rates that were projected as part of the update assessment last year, which were at 0.14. So it follows intuitively that if fishing mortality stays in between the target and threshold, rather than the levels more closely associated with fishing mortality in 2021, we would see a substantial decrease in rebuilding SSB to the target by 2029. Next slide, please. So this table appears in the memo, and I'll just sort of orient you to this table. So we've highlighted two columns in particular. The first column, which is sort of a thumbnail description of the projection methods, and the fifth column, this is the probability of SSB being greater than or equal to the target by 2029. The first row, these are the results you would have saw late last year as part of the assessment update. The probabilities have been updated to reflect the change I mentioned in the first or second slide. And it showed when you saw these results last year that the probability of rebuilding was about 98%. The next three rows are the scenarios we worked through to address the most recent board task. So scenario one, again, is sort of the status quo scenario, no additional commercial quota being incorporated. The probability of rebuilding to the target is about 15%. Scenarios 2 and 3, this is now the different usages of the additional commercial quota. So in scenario 2, this is the full ocean quota being used. Scenario 3, full ocean quota minus New Jersey. And those results are identical. In both cases, there's an 11% probability of rebuilding to the target. And then to just maybe quickly highlight the last column in this table, this is the probability of SSB reaching the threshold by 2029. And you can see in all cases, that probability is over 90%. Next slide, please. In terms of the impacts of removals, we'll show a slide next that graphically illustrates the results, but by way of introducing the results, the increased recreational removals in 2022 are driving the increase in fishing mortality rates and the lower rebuilding probabilities in all the scenarios, as opposed to, for example, the additional commercial quota. We'll see in the next slide, the projections indicate spawning stock biomass increases over time from below the threshold to in between the target and threshold, where it stabilizes over time. This aligns with our expectation that if we're projecting an F in between the target and threshold, spawning stock biomass will remain between the target and threshold, all things being equal. So in order to rebuild SSB to the target by 2029, fishing mortality will need to be at or below its target. Next slide, please. So yeah, the graphical depiction of the results, and again, just to maybe orient you to the plots, the top row shows the SSB trajectory under various projection scenarios indicated by the sort of gray headers at the top of each column. And I'll just sort of step through those column headers. So the far left column, this is the kind of status quo, no additional commercial quota. So fishing mortality, projecting the average fishing mortality from 2019, 21, and 22. The next column over is the scenario where we're incorporating the full ocean quota. And next column over, the third column, is the full ocean quota minus New Jersey. And the fourth column, we've included, again, the projections you saw last year, projecting F 2021 forward. The bottom row shows the trajectory of probabilities of reaching either the SSB target, that's the red line, or the probability of reaching the threshold, that's the black line. You'll notice that bottom row of plots is scaled from 0 to 1, so a probability of 0 to 100% probability of achieving those goals. And then finally, maybe just to mention that the x-axis in each of these plots ranges from 2022 through 2029. And so revisiting that top row of plots, again, you can see that SSB starts out below the threshold in all the scenarios. Under the updated projections, SSB stabilizes between the target and threshold, not reaching the target, whereas our expectation from last year's projections were more optimistic. And maybe in the interest of time, looking at the bottom row of plots, if we focus just on the red line, so this again is the probability of SSB reaching the SSB target. So for each of the first 3 plots, you can see there's a very low 0% probability of reaching the target. And then by the end of the time series 2029, each of those first 3 scenarios ends up between about 10 and 15% probability of reaching the target. And ideally, we would wanted that to have been at least 50%. Next slide, please. A little more discussion on the 2022 removals here. Some points that the TC and SAS wanted to make. The groups noted that angler effort and behavior is an important factor and an important source of uncertainty. Another thing the TC and SAS wanted to note was that as the stock recovers and or if strong year classes become available, effort may increase. That may contribute to increased harvest and live releases as well. The projections assume a constant fishing mortality or constant catch. Those are not necessarily representative of future years, since I mentioned earlier, striped bass catch and fishing mortality can vary from year to year, even under a constant regulation. Then lastly, I guess we'll just note that the projections based on the 2022 removals represent a higher catch outlook. The projections that we showed at the end of last year as part of the update assessment represent a lower catch outlook. If the future catch is in between that sort of low outlook and the high outlook, it stands to reason that the probabilities of rebuilding are likely to be between the 15% at the low end and 97% at the high end. Next slide, please. We have a figure that we'll show next, but again, just to maybe kind of talk through some of the results in preparation of that result. So first, the projections suggest that the impact of additional quota utilization on the fishing mortality and rebuilding probability is negligible. We have essentially calculated the highest possible fishing mortality that could result from 2022 removals and increased quota utilization, and the results are still almost the same as scenario 1, the no quota utilization, no extra quota utilization scenario. The next slide will make that a little more clear. So the fishing mortality is only about 2% higher in scenarios 2 and 3 versus scenario 1. So we get 2% higher incorporating the additional quota versus not including it, resulting in a slightly lower rebuilding probability, about 4% lower. But we think this has more to do with our projection assumptions than the additional quota use. So I mentioned in one of the earlier slides that in scenario 1, the scenario where we're not incorporating the additional commercial quota, we're taking an average F from 2019, 21, and 22. But I also mentioned that in scenarios 2 and 3, these are the scenarios where we're incorporating the additional commercial quota, we're taking an average F from 2019, 21, and 23. So what we're seeing is the effect of some population dynamics between 2022 and 2023 contributing to that difference. We don't show this in the memo, but there's actually a decline in abundance between 2022 and 2023. And over that span, we're holding catch constant or in fact increasing it a little bit. So that actually has the effect of slightly increasing F. So scenario 1, we have a sort of a true constant F approach, and scenarios 2 and 3, we have kind of a mixture of constant catch and constant F. So it's not a direct apples to apples comparison. But again, another one of the sort of big points we wanted to make is that the quota utilization scenarios add about 42,000 extra fish. That's 42,000 extra fish on 6.9 total removals. So a really small number of additional fish. Yeah, next slide, please. So to sort of graphically depict some of the things I just talked through, and again, to orient you to the plot, this is a plot of SSB over time from 2022 through 2029. We have some horizontal lines plotted. The top line is the SSB target. The bottom dotted line is the SSB threshold. I'll draw your attention first to the pink shaded region in this plot. These are the projections that you would have seen in last year as part of the update assessment. This is kind of our lower catch outlook that has the SSB trajectory exceeding the SSB target. For the other scenarios, if we look at the legend in the bottom portion of the plot, you'll see the sort of tan or yellow region. That's scenario 1, the scenario where we're not incorporating the additional commercial quota. And you'll see there's a blue box and a green box. Those are scenarios 2 and 3, where we're incorporating the additional commercial quota, either with or without New Jersey. The first things I'll say is that the blue and green shaded region in the plot above are completely indistinguishable. So accounting for New Jersey or subtracting New Jersey has had no impact. We do see a modest difference between the yellow shaded region and the blue-green shaded regions. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, again, we think this has more to do with some of our assumptions. We think with a more direct apples to apples comparison, those regions would align even more closely. Next slide, please. Yeah, so to finish with some final TC and SAS thoughts on the interim projections, the group discussed the benefits and challenges, kind of the pros and cons of conducting stock projections between stock assessments. So in this case, the benefit of the interim projections was a timely update to the board in light of a couple of things. One, a significant increase in 2022 recreational removals following 2 low catch years, which also included COVID-19 uncertainty. There was also the emergence of the strong 2015 year class, the 4th largest year class in the time series, that likely played some role in the 2022 increase in removals. Additionally, the TC and SAS noted that the interim projections are not the same thing as a full stock assessment. So we didn't create a catch at age matrix. We didn't incorporate fishery independent or dependent indices. We didn't generate estimates of SSB and fishing mortality from which we could update stock status. The TC and SAS also felt that annual projections would not be particularly useful given interannual variability in removals. I talked about that earlier. We see variability in removals even under constant regulations. We also thought that striped bass life history would have a role to play here as well. This is kind of a long-lived, slow to mature species, as opposed to very short-lived species where annual projections could be more useful. And then finally, the TC and SAS talked about the potential benefits of aligning projections and assessments with planned management changes. And with that, I'd be happy to try to take any questions.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you and Gary and all the members of the technical committee and the stock assessment subcommittee for all your hard work. Appreciate it. Not the news we were hoping for, but here we are. So at this point, I'd like to open it up to questions only. Chair and staff have received motions, so we'll save that for discussion. For any questions they have for Mike. Start with Lauren Lustig.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to Mike for a very good presentation to us. I did take note in the presentation the issue that we saw of request or explanation, further explanation of that, and also a recommendation that I have for this board in order to reduce that.
I'm not sure if anyone can hear me. I wasn't able to hear most of that question. The relevant parts of the question, the audio is cut out. I'm sorry if someone can repeat that.
Sure. So the question from elaborate further on the uncertainty around angler effort and behavior, and if you had any recommendation or thoughts on how to address that uncertainty going forward.
Okay, thanks, Emily. Oh, yeah, great question. It's humbling that I don't have a great answer. That I think continues to plague and perplex the TC and SAS. There's the issue of availability that can influence effort. I guess the short answer is I don't have a great answer. I don't have, rather than sort of speculate or spin my wheels, I'll just say that I don't have a great answer. I think it's something that the TC and SAS has struggled with, and it's a humbling realization.
Thank you, Lauren, and thank you, Mike. So we have a number of board members in queue here. So we'll go with John Clark, Tom Foti, Jason McNamee, and Bill Hyatt. So go ahead, John.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the presentation, Mike. Just curious, looking at those MRIP numbers for 2022 and then 21, I looked back for some of the states that had the largest jumps, and 2022 was actually quite a bit higher in the harvest estimates than it was before Addendum 6 went into place. Was there skepticism on the TC about the MRIP? I mean, it seems with other species, like if this was black sea bass, we'd be pretty much saying, here's another steaming pile of MRIP data. Whereas with striped bass, it looks like we're acting like these are carved in stone and handed down from on high. So I'm just curious, you know, I mean, the MRIP data, especially, was 2021 the anomalous year? Was 2022 seemed to be a blip? It's just really odd how the harvest increased so much. And for some of these states, as I said, the harvest was a lot higher than it was before Addendum 6 went into place. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for that question. Wonder if we can bring up slide 24, or show slide 24 on the presentation. That just shows sort of the time series of removals. I don't know if anyone can hear me.
Yes, we're working on it, Mike.
Okay, thank you. Oh, perfect. So yeah, just the time series of removals to kind of cast that 7 million removals in context. So yeah, really good question. You can see we haven't hit that level of removals in, as John indicated, since probably it looks like maybe 2016, 17 or so. To maybe to answer the more direct answer to the question. So it's not something that the TC or SAS really spent any time talking about. We didn't pour into the raw intercept data to see if there were suspicious anomalies. We sort of take these values as the best estimate. We don't have a competing estimate, and so yeah, I again don't have a great answer except to say that it wasn't something that the TC and SAS spent. My recollection is that we didn't spend really any time talking about that value, other than okay, let's incorporate this into our work.
I know John has a follow, but Katie would like to add some comment.
Yeah, so I think while the TC didn't formally discuss that, I don't think anybody was very shocked at this because of the fact that we knew we had that strong year class moving into the fishery, becoming legally available. And we also saw much higher quota utilization in several states on the commercial side coinciding with this. So it really did seem to, well, it seemed to me, and I think to staff, maybe not to the full TC, but I think it did seem sort of not an MRIP problem, but really more an issue of a strong year class becoming available to an ocean fishery that has not had a strong year class in a while move through.
Well, I can understand that to a degree, but it doesn't explain why 2021 was so low. You get down to the part of the range where we are, where the recreational fishery used to take place mostly in the fall. We rarely see striped bass in state waters in the fall. I'd say what now, Roy, maybe 5 years, 6 years since we've seen, you know, so we're looking at, I'd say, a moderate level to a decreasing level of recreational harvest in our area. And our commercial catch has just been steady. I haven't seen really any change in the spring runs based on our effort and landings. You know, as I said, it just seems to me that with other species, we're much more skeptical when we see a year that is, as I said, one of those years seems to me to be an anomaly. Maybe it's 21, but it just seems like a huge jump. Thanks.
Thank you, John. We'll go to Tom Foti.
I think I have a little different interpretation of what happened in 2022. If you look at 2021 and you look at previous years before that, and I've been looking at this history of striped bass when these big blitzes occur. And it always is about 4 or 5 years after these beach replenishment projects stop along the coast. Because when the beach replenishment next year, following year, when the beach replenishment programs, when they disturb the lumps, when they basically put all this, like we did in New Jersey, put peat from Ice Age forest that was 3 miles offshore and pumped it on the beach, that water comes out and fish stay away from the water. The other thing we looked at this year, and you can't get away from it, we never went to an ocean water temperature below 42 degrees. I mean, which means we don't have I don't expect a big sand eel spawn off New Jersey because you need cold water like 36 degrees. So we should be, are we looking at those factors that basically apply? With the warm water, the Menhaden came in, and that when Menhaden comes in and the other bait comes in and they stay for long periods of time, that's when we have this huge number of catches. And the same thing happened 10 or 15 years ago when the Atlantic sea herring came in and basically stayed along the beach. And all of a sudden, New Jersey's catch and New York's catch jumped up dramatically. So a lot of this is opportunity. And this year, we're doing beach replenishment again because there's been storms and everything else. And so we'll affect the water for the next couple of years. I live in Toms River, and usually we have snow. We usually shovel. I didn't have an inch of snow this year in Toms River. I basically, my lagoon, which when I moved into my house used to have 10 inches of ice, where I had to hire a guy in the spring to put my pilings down. I haven't had to do that in 20 years. We've changed the ecology, and the same thing with Delaware Bay and the Chesapeake Bay. And how is that affecting us? We can't use just catch figures to look at that, because catch figures a lot of times depends if the bait moves inshore. Because again, we're a 3 mile limit. If we were at the EEZ open, we might have been seeing these catches all the time because people would be fishing with a tagging boat basically is 35 miles offshore. So really we need to look at what that is playing into the role of this and look at where water temperature does not stay at 42 degrees. I remember when in November, we used to be waiting for the bluefish to migrate out because it was 44 degrees, and that was November. And we were gone by December. We stopped fishing with striped bass most of the times after Thanksgiving. Now you never stop. It's there all year round. Even in the bad years, we're not in because they come in the bays and estuary with the warm water. So we're not taking any of that into consideration. I mean, we had the best year in New Jersey, of course. Annual meeting stayed out to December, so I never fished for any of those fish this year. I sat there and died because it's 10 years before we had a blitz like that on the beach. But let's look at all the factors involved, not just the catch numbers, because the catch numbers are not isolated. They depend on water temperature and water quality. And we should be looking at, we know in the spring, if the heavy rains will affect the spawning of striped bass, and we basically don't know those rules yet either. And we've been arguing that thing for 30 factors at all when you're basically doing these estimates.
Thanks, Tom. So is that a question to Mike you're asking? Okay. Mike, did you get that?
I lost the tail end of what Tom had said, but I guess I would just say I think those are I guess my response would be those are really good research questions, but all beyond the scope of what we were able to consider as part of this current task. I imagine a more sort of thorough evaluation would happen as part of the next benchmark, but yeah, beyond the scope of what we were able to look at for this task.
Okay, thank you. We'll go to Jason McNamee and then Bill Hyatt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Hey, Mike, thank you very much. Just my compliments to the technical committee and the stock assessment committee for a really well done and thoughtful memo. So appreciate that. My question, I'm going to cram 2 questions in here, but I'm going to pretend that they're one with a follow-up. So harvest went up. Discards also went up, but not nearly at the same rate. So I'm curious as to whether in your mind, or if the technical committee talked about this, does that corroborate this idea that this is what we're witnessing as a year class effect? So it's that 2015 year class moving into the slot. Therefore, there was, a pretty high success rate. So there wasn't as much discarding going on. So I'm wondering if those things are connected. And then my follow-up is that 2015 year class fully recruited into that slot, or are they still moving into the range of that slot? In other words, I'm trying to get a sense of whether if we believe it's a year class effect that's influencing harvest, if we can presume that harvest will be as high, if not higher, next year. So thanks for that, Mike. And if you missed any of that, happy to quickly repeat it.
No, thank you, Jay. I did get that. Thanks for your comment earlier too. Appreciate that. So yeah, to the two questions, I guess, yeah, the short answer is yes. I think the TC, I had forgotten. I was glad Katie mentioned that. We did spend a little bit of time talking about that sort of emergence of the 2015 year class becoming sort of fully available to the slot limit, or really available to the slot limit. So I think that does sort of it does sort of play into that, sort of lend some credibility to the increase in harvest, but maybe not discards. Though to be honest, at least I didn't look into surrounding year classes. Where we're seeing the 2018 year class, which is another, it's not nearly as large, but that is it's a reasonably large year class. So it really difficult to kind of tease that apart. But we, as Katie mentioned, we did sort of acknowledge that that 2015 year class being within the slot limit, which is a nice lead into your following question. And I actually haven't looked at it in a little while, but the TC does have a tool that we used as last year to sort of help us with some of our regulation questions, some of the questions the board had tasked us. And if memory serves, that 2015 year class is still in kind of the meaty part of the curve. The meaty part of the distribution of that year class is still available to that slot limit, if memory serves. I'm guessing a little bit on that, but maybe commission staff have some helpful slides here. Oh, great. So yeah, so let's see here. Yeah, mean size as a function of age, and you can see where the year classes are. So this is sort of the information we were using to make those judgments earlier, and they've been updated to reflect where they are for 2023. So you can kind of see where the mean length is. So thank you for staff for being so quick on the draw on that.
And so this was from the memo that we put together, I think or presented to the board in January of last year, or 2022.
All right, thank you, Jay. And Bill Hyatt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question tied in very closely to the question that John asked and what Jay asked. I was simply curious to know whether the increase in 22 harvest was due primarily to the 2015 year class or due to an increase in angler effort. I think it's been partially answered, but if there's anything more to add, it'd be appreciated. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that follow-up. I don't have a memory of looking specifically at effort. Maybe commission staff did, so I can't comment on that. And yeah, sort of getting at the exact causes for the increase, it's a bit speculative, but I think there was definitely some discussion at the TC level that 2015 year class being available to the slot limit played some role. I think there was general agreement on that. The additional factors of effort, I just don't recall if we actually did see an increase in effort. Maybe someone else can chime in on that if they recall.
So yes, we looked sort of behind the scenes at this, and there definitely was an increase in effort on the Atlantic coast, sort of from the Maine down through North Virginia region. Overall, total trips did increase in 2020. and directed trips for striped bass also increased more than, I think, more than the than total trips did. So I think there was a combination of there are more fish available and that there were more people taking trips and directing on striped bass. Are those two things related? Probably, but it is a combination of increased availability, but also it looks like increased effort in 2022 compared to 2021 as well.
All right, thank you, Bill. Any final questions for Mike? Okay, we'll go John Clark and Tom Foti, and then we're going to transition into discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mine is quick. I just was wondering, since we're going to be discussing the 2022 harvest and our response to that first, will Mike be available to ask questions when we get to the discussion of Addendum 1? Because I think it would probably be better to ask questions about that discussion later on in the morning.
Mike, will you be able to stay on for the rest of the morning?
Yes, that was my plan for sure. I'm happy to help with any questions if I can.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Mike. We'll go to Tom Foti for the last question.
Yeah, when I bring up the questions they were asking, I was wondering if we really knew the size limit of a lot of the fisheries. I heard there was a lot of big fish that were released in that period of time, in September, October, November, December, because they were basically being there. And again, that was from the surf. And we usually, with surveying and even MREPs, has a poor record of actually doing surf fishing in numbers. And we saw a dramatic increase in what went on surf, because you're catching fish up 40 inches, 50 inches, and they were releasing them from the surf, not only from the boats. So I was wondering how that played and how New Jersey's numbers looked on that, because I would assume that we were one of the parts for the real increase in catch. The other thing is when we look at the numbers, do we know the kept fish and the released fish, what year classes they belong to? Because we do a poor estimate of those numbers also. So we don't know whether it was all big fish being released or small fish being released.
Yeah, so those are really good questions, and I guess I'll just say I don't have any information on that at the ready. That's not something that the TC or SAS looked at on a sort of state by state level. Perhaps commission staff did something behind the scenes, but I don't have anything I don't have any information to bring to the table that from TC or SAS discussions.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think we do have some numbers by mode, but not by state. But I think the larger question of like what age classes are being kept versus being released, obviously MRIP only has length information on the retained, the harvested fish. We did not look at the age composition of that yet. We did not have age data, et cetera. That'll be part of the compliance reports. And similarly, the information that we have on the size composition of the released alive fish comes from a number of different sources, mostly volunteer angler logbook programs. And so those data were not available to us for 2022 when we did this component of it. We will be, we may be able to look at that later on this year for once we actually request those data from the states, but that's not part of the MRIP data. And so that was not available at the time that we did this analysis.
All right, thank you, Tom. Thank you, Katie, for the clarification. So before we transition to discussion, we do have one member of the public who is interested in asking a question, and his name is Steve Atkinson. If you could unmute yourself, and please, only questions only at this point.
And Steve, it looks like you're just self-muted on your end. So if you click on the microphone button, if you'd like to ask a question.
Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
I'm sorry. I hit that question by mistake. My apologies.
No problem. Thank you.
Okay, no worries, Steve. All right, so we're going to transition into discussion. Before we do so, I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that weighed in. Oh, Mike, you haven't asked a question, so go ahead.
I'm sorry, it's not really a question, but I think it'll be helpful for questions that Jay asked. This isn't vetted through the TC, so take it with a grain of salt, but it's it's all crafted by Gary Nelson, who, has done all the projections. So we have a very robust recreational sampling program, and we aged all that. A lot of the questions, so probably 55% of the year class was in the slot. And when you grow it up 2 inches, 100% will be in the slot. And for ages, it was about 2/3 2015s, maybe 1/3 2014s, and a little bit of 2016s. So I wanted to throw that in because so many people have not seen these data. And I'll be making a motion later that will be germane to this. I'm lucky I get to sit 30 feet from Gary Nelson. So I'm privy to things that not everyone gets to see till later on. So I want to throw that out. So I hope that's helpful to people who had the questions. This year class will be fully in the slot this year and wasn't last year. Thank you for your forbearance.
Thank you, Mike. That is very, very helpful for our discussion, which we're about to start. But before we do so, just an acknowledgement for all the folks in the public who took the time to write into the board. If you looked in your supplemental materials, there were a huge amount of comments from individuals, from businesses, from charter boat associations, Connecticut, Rhode Island, light tackle guides associations, the ASGA, conservation organizations. In one case, I think there were hundreds, if not well over 1,000 individuals and businesses that signed on to submit their concerns to us. And just on behalf of the board to the public, we really value that highly, and we appreciate the time that you took, and we will absolutely consider it. So thank you. So next we're going to transition into discussion. And what I'd like to do, since we've received a number of motions in the sake of efficiency, I'd like to frame our discussion around. So I'm going to look to the board for any motions, and Dr. Davis, could you get us started?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a motion that I provided to staff this morning, so I'll just wait to see if we can get that up on the board. There it is. Move to initiate an addendum to implement commercial and recreational measures for the ocean and Chesapeake Bay fisheries in 2024 that in aggregate are projected to achieve F target from the 2022 stock assessment update, F equals 0.17. Potential measures for the ocean recreational fishery should include modifications to the Addendum 6 standard slot limit of 28 to 35 inches and harvest season closures as a secondary non-preferred option. Potential measures for Chesapeake Bay recreational fisheries as well as ocean and bay commercial fisheries should include maximum size limits.
Thank you. We have second. We'll go with Emerson Hasbrook. And back to you, Dr. Davis, if you would like to speak to your motion.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, we find ourselves about halfway through our 10-year rebuilding timeline for this stock. And, I think the board is facing another decision point here on how to act. I think since the stock was declared overfished in 2018, this board's got an excellent track record of taking conservative action to rebuild this stock. At Addendum 6, we implemented a slot limit, which was really a new coast-wide management strategy for striped bass because there was good science to suggest protecting older, larger fish would be beneficial to the stock. We implemented a circle hook requirement, even though it wasn't entirely clear how we would quantify the benefits of that, and there were enforcement concerns, but we knew it would help with conservation, so we implemented it. And then in the Amendment 7 process, we chose to retain really, conservative reference points and aim to build the high biomass, and also incorporated a low recruitment assumption into our rebuilding plan. So I think this board's got a great track record of taking conservative action, and this addendum, the motion to initiate this addendum, is hopefully in the service of the board again making a conservative decision here when faced with information about what's going on with the stock. So in the presentation we just heard, we have clear indication that removals in 2022 were very high, and there's good reason to believe that we are now off track for rebuilding. The board is not compelled to act. We have not tripped a management trigger. As was mentioned in the presentation, we're not dealing right now with a new stock assessment update or true updated estimates of F, so the board doesn't have to act. but I think the board should. I think we should take some precautionary, decisive action to get ourselves back on track for rebuilding. So that's the goal of this motion, is to start a management process for 2024 to accomplish that. In fact, there's been a lot of discussion around the table about the potential need for action this year to get us back on track for rebuilding. And I don't want to short circuit that discussion, but I do just want to explain why I'm sort of putting forward the motion for the addendum for 2024 before we talk about what we might do for this year. And my rationale there is, my understanding is if we do something for this year, it's going to be using a process that is not our normal management process, not going to include the normal type of deliberation we do, and is not going to include public input. I'm not saying I'm not comfortable with doing that, but I'm not comfortable with extending that for 2 years. So before we consider what we're going to do for this year, I think it's important to signal to the public that we'll do a process for next year that's more in keeping with our normal management process. So the goal here with this addendum is to establish new measures for 2024 for all sectors. So all sectors are contributing to conservation. We have to set some goal to sort of engineer measures too. So I chose F target from the last assessment here, because I think that's an appropriate goal, given that out of the last assessment, that was an F rate that was projected to achieve rebuilding. I'll acknowledge that this is sort of a departure from our normal process. We usually don't engineer measures for 1 year for F in 1 year and sort of key in on 1 year, but I think we're sort of in a tricky spot here because we have a new assessment coming in 2024 that can inform 25. And so I think what we do beyond 2024 should be informed by that new assessment. So that's why I'm sort of suggesting that we do something here that's geared towards 1 year in 2024. I'm not looking to start sort of a new management regime for striped bass where we get into a model of assessing what happens every year and then making a decision for next year and doing it on an annual basis. I don't think that's a good approach, but I think it's kind of what's necessary in this instance. So I think the addendum is going to have to be kind of lean in acknowledgement of the timeline we're on to get something done for 2024 and also the ongoing workload of the technical committee with the assessment coming. So I've attempted to sort of draw some boundaries here around what types of options could be considered in the addendum. For the ocean fishery, modifications to the slot limit of 28 to 35 inches and harvest season closures is a secondary non-preferred option. I think that's in keeping with the discussions we had during the Amendment 7 process when we were considering potential board action coming out of the last assessment. We thought modifications to the slot and then harvest season closures if we need them, if the potential slot limits are just so conservative that we really can't live with them. So that's the approach I'm suggesting for the ocean fishery. For the Chesapeake Bay fishery, taking a look at maximum size limits, either a consistent slot for the bay or just imposing a maximum size limit where it currently doesn't exist. And for commercial fisheries, taking a look at maximum size limits. A common complaint I hear from recreational anglers is that we've adopted this slot limit. We're preventing recreational anglers from taking large fish. We're still allowing the commercial sector to take those larger fish. I get that there's market considerations there. The market wants the larger fish, but I think it's worth exploring imposing a maximum size limit in the commercial fishery to provide additional protection for those larger fish. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Justin. Emerson, would you like to speak as a seconder?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with everything that Dr. Davis just mentioned, and he's given a reason to support his motion, and I can't really add too much more to that. However, we do need to start an addendum now to address the high recreation and the increased fishing mortality. Build on schedule. And Mr. Chairman, about the public comment that we've received, and much of that public comment encourages us to start an addendum. And again, this does not exclude the board from taking some action for 2023 once we've decided what we're going to do with the addendum. Thank you.
Thank you, Emerson. Go to Mike Louisi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank Dr. Davis and Emerson for putting this motion before the board at this time. I think there's been a lot of work that's gone into this motion behind the scenes, and I absolutely agree with everything here as far as moving forward for 2024. I like the concepts that that are proposed here, including modifications to the slot limit. And the one thing that I do think is something we haven't talked, like the idea of the Chesapeake Bay commercial fisheries, as well as the ocean fisheries, considering maximum size limits. Right. And maybe for Justin, but I'm assuming that based on what you've outlined here, that quota reductions aren't something on the table. It would be focused mostly or entirely on maximum size limits there. I just think that's something good to understand for all of us that have commercial fisheries. Lastly, I will say that in Mike Celestino's presentation of the technical committee report, there was a lot of talk when it came to the recreational fisheries. There was a lot of discussion about removals, and removals, as we all know, and is a combination of both harvest and dead discards. Yet I don't see anything in here that would refer to any type of consideration or action for any dead discard consideration in moving forward in 2024. It is something that I certainly feel pretty strongly about. It's not that I can't support the motion, but I would like to see some acknowledgement of discards being considered, because it does play a critical role in the overall mortality of the fishery. And with the understanding that, yes, discards will happen, dead fish will happen as a result of this, extremely important recreational and commercial fishery on our coast. I just would like there to be some consideration of that. So I'm going to give it, have to say, Mr. Chairman, I may be inclined to provide some simple language for an amendment to the motion, but I'd like to hear what others have to say first. But thanks, Justin, for putting this together.
Justin, would you like to respond?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for those questions, Mike. I did mean to say that and I forgot. My intent with this motion is that any types of measures that I haven't mentioned here in the motion would not be considered in this addendum. So to your point, commercial quota adjustments is not something I'm contemplating with this motion. And I agree that this does not propose measures that directly address release mortality and discards. I agree with you that that's got to be part of the picture going forward. My intent was to try to keep this addendum fairly constrained, and so I thought maybe it would be better to deal with that question in the next management action that we take out of the 24 assessment, but that's just my thought.
Okay, we have John Clark, Senator Waters, and then Mike Armstrong.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the motion, Justin. I have a question for Dr. Davis also, especially the last sentence there about the maximum size limits for commercial fisheries. While we might want to take actions to on the commercial fisheries, maximum size limits for a lot of fisheries, for example, ours, which is a gillnet fishery, we have ITQs. I mean, you really can't control, even if you're using a smaller mesh net, you could still end up catching fish that, based on a maximum size limit, would be discarded dead. And there's not much point in that, especially when it is, as I said, ITQ. I would not object to seeing, back when we did addendum 3, there was a lot of push to have mandatory tagging of by both the fisherman and a dealer or a weigh station, and that was watered down to just mandatory tagging at a dealer. So, I mean, there are options we can do to get a better handle on what's actually being caught in the commercial fishery, and a lot of states, like our own state, are doing that. But I'm just a little concerned about putting the only type of control up there for commercial fisheries is maximum size limits. So just wondering if I don't know if Mike was planning to address that with his amendment, but it just seems a little that if it's in the motion, that's what we're going to be looking at in an addendum rather than other measures on the commercial side. Thanks.
Thanks, John. Senator Waters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a question for Dr. Davis about the wording of the amendment. I think in the sentence that you have potential measures for the ocean recreational fishery should include modifications to the addendum 6 standard slot limit of 28 to 35 inches and harvest season closures as a secondary non-preferred option. Unless you want both of those to be secondary non-preferred options, I think that you want to change it to with harvest season closures. Isn't that your intent? So I just thought that maybe is a wording issue.
Thank you for that, Senator, and that is my intent. So I would look to staff if they feel like that clarification is necessary and helpful, and the seconder is okay with it. I'm good with it.
Yes, I'm good with that. It just clarifies things. Thank you.
Okay, we'll just wait a moment till we get that modified. Okay, Mike Armstrong, you're next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I completely support this motion, but I do want to amend it by adding some language. And this actually works out well because I don't want to derail this potential motion, but I do have language that I would like to be considered. Are you ready? Unfortunately, I don't think you have the language anywhere. Go slow. You may. Why, yes, you do have it. Would you like me to read it into the record? Yes. I move to add the addendum will include an option for provision enabling the board to respond via board action to the results of the upcoming stock assessment updates currently scheduled for 2024 and 26 if the stock is not projected to rebuild by 2029 with a probability greater than or equal to 50%.
All right, we have an amendment. Second David Borden. And Mike, would you like to speak to this?
Yes, please. So I made a similar motion on the last amendment and that retired. My concern here is the proposed addendum will not have the 2023 harvest in it, and that'll have to be projected. And when the new stock assessment comes in, we will surely have to look at new measures for 2025 in order to accomplish our goals. Without this language, we're going to have to start another addendum, and we won't get that in until 2025. So, sorry. Yeah, 2026. Anyway, we'll have a lag here if we don't have this process here. So anyway, for the same reasons I had it on the amendment that we needed to act quick. The complaint is always we don't act quickly enough. The cost is we will have to do this without a lot of public comment. But the benefit is we are approaching some fairly dire straits here with this stock. And I think we need to react quickly from the assessment. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Mike. David, any comments you want to add?
Nothing to add. Mike just made the point. Thank you.
Okay, we have an amended motion. And Tom, you had raised your hand. Do you want to maintain your place in the queue to comment or relinquish?
Yeah, I'll comment on the new motion, and I'll comment when you get back to the original motion.
All right.
My concern about putting that date on this, we will not have the 2023. So we do not know if the 2022 was an abnormal year because of the certain conditions and bringing all these fish and allowing, because of the access of the anglers to basically exceed. this year it could be cold. We could have 14, 18 inches of snow in Tom's River, and the ocean could be back down to where it's supposed to be at water temperature, which I hope that's what happens, but we don't know. And if we act before we know what 2023 looks like, or at least we have an estimate of what the catch for 2023 looks like, then we're moving ahead. I'm concerned over that. I mean, I understand what we're doing and I support the original motion. I was going to say I support, this is an unusual situation. I support the first 4 speakers. And I get to Mike and I have to deliberate a little bit on how I support this. Again, I've seen this over the years, and some of you know how long I've been sitting around this table, but they also know that I was sitting on 1986 at the striped bass board. And until the 90s, we didn't do knee-jerk reactions. We did a couple. That's how come New Jersey wound up with a 24 to 28 inch slot limit. And then you decided 2 years old, that wasn't what we should do. We should go back to another. Then you also basically took away the producing area status of the Delaware Bay, which will allow us to manage fisheries different and set up quotas differently than we do now. And we should be putting that back in. We've talked about this a number of times for the Delaware Bay and the Hudson River both. And because New York waited till New Jersey left the meeting and slipped this thing in Amendment 5, and by the time we came back, we couldn't get a 2/3 vote to override that. So I understand all. I've been around this table a long time, and I understand nuances that happened here. So I have concerns when we go to this is that it's really, we need to incorporate the 2023 to see what's going on and see if this was an abnormal year in 2022 and basically look at it. As we move into any knee-jerk reactions, people are talking about emergency action. What's a knee-jerk reaction? Plus you have no public comment, no public hearings. And I will say I will have a problem with that, but I'll at least bring it out to the public because I know the economic impact of doing something like that. And also the state's problem is try to enforce that and get it in 180 days, because it might be the 180th day when we put it in place. So I'll leave it at that at this time. And I'll talk to your original motion week.
All right, thank you, Tom. I'm going to go to Doug Grout and then Megan Ware.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I certainly support the underlying motion, and I definitely like the concept here of if we're not going to have a 50% or greater probability of rebuilding, that be something that we would trigger some further action. One of the concerns I had with the current stock assessment schedule was if, let's say, we go through the addendum process and we put in some measures that go into effect in 2024. We're going to have an assessment in 2024 that is not going to take into account the effects of that, the changes we make in the addendum. So we could be chasing our own tail with that, because we could look at it and say, well, based on 2023 data and previous data, we're still have a huge jump. We need to make some action, but we've already taken action that's not included in that. And while I wasn't going to bring this up at this point, because of this, I was going to suggest at a future meeting that maybe we postpone our next bench or next full assessment to 2025, so that we could take into account the effects of whatever our addendum is. Just a thought for people here, and we can still vote this up or down, but if we change the assessment date, it might be more valuable information for us.
Thank you, Doug. Megan Ware.
Thank you. To the motion to amend, I'm going to support this. I think thinking back on what we heard from the TC this morning about trying to align management action and the stock assessment schedule, this gives us an opportunity to do that, so that if we need to take action after that 2024 assessment, we could do that in 2025. That would give us a year of data through 2025 in that 2026 stock assessment. So I think that is worth having as an option in the addendum that goes in. And I see this as an option for the board. So for some reason, if the board chooses to not pursue this and go through the traditional addendum route, that's always available to us. But I think it's worth having this option in the document.
Thank you, Megan. Any other comments? Oh, I'm sorry. Katie wanted to jump in for a moment, and then we'll go to John Clark.
Yeah, I think just related to the question of what kind of information is going to be available from the 2024 assessment. So we will have 2023 data in the assessment, and if any emergency action is taken that goes into place in 2023, that will be captured within the assessment for that terminal year of 2023. And the question is, if we put something in place for 2024, what are the effects of that going to be? And that's something we can incorporate in the projection up these options, and the final option that will be chosen will have sort of a reduction in harvest that we're predicting based on year class availability, things like that. And so the projections would include for 2024 kind of our management, our projected management completely from projections to say, we would say 2024 and the management measures we put into what is actually, but we will be able to incorporate the fact that there will be changes in 2024 relative to 2023 when we do those projections.
Thank you, Katie. Before I go to John, we have an amendment to the motion up, and I would like to get some public input, but we're going to do this in a very balanced and measured manner. So when John finishes his comment, we will go to the public and take 2 comments from the public in favor of this and 2 against it if there are in either camp. And we'll do those in a concise manner and allow the public, for anyone who wishes to, 1 minute each. So John, we'll go to you first.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a question for Dr. Armstrong. I assume when you say rebuild, you mean rebuild to the target. And I've been very clear that I think the SSB target is pretty unrealistic. And just looking at those last projections we saw, Mike, it looked like we have a real good possibility of being above the threshold, which by definition is 100% of the fully restored stock based on 1995, but obviously a much lower probability of reaching the target. And I mean, this target reminds me of every year I go for my physical, my doctor gives me a target weight that I last hit in 1975, and I don't expect I'm ever going to hit that target. So I'm just, my question here is, I mean, based on each assessment update, it seems like we have a change in what the target will be, but this seems very, very definitive that if we're not at 50 action. So I'm just curious, you know, the way it ties into this very high SSB target. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's problematic. But I would say this is the rebuilt is the target. So that's how I'm viewing it. I mean, that's something we're going to have to look at carefully, especially with the low productivity we're getting. If I could add one more comment, does that answer you, John?
Right.
Yeah. I just want to make it clear, this is an option. This is not mandatory. If, you know, if it comes in at 49%, we don't have to go this route. If just gives us flexibility. And again, I think we're approaching some difficult days ahead, and I would like to have an option to move very fast if we need be.
All right, thank you, Mike, and thank you, John. So now we're going to try to go to public here. Again, do this in a concise and measured manner. So I don't know, staff, it's Madeline or who will help with a timer, but I look for a show of hands here in the room and online. And the first thing we would look for is 2 in favor. So, so anyone who is in favor of the amendment, and I see 1 hand raised, that would be Mike Wayne. So Mike, if you come up to the public microphone, that would be great.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mike Wayne with the American Sport Fishing Association. It's hard to indicate preference from the back of the room, so I'm not going to speak for or against this motion to amend, but if the board moves forward with this, in the addendum, I highly recommend that they plan out the timeline in which these actions would occur. What years is the board going to consider taking action? What information are they going to use to do that action, so that the public can get some sort of an understanding about how they're going to participate in this board action process?
Thank you, Mike. We'll look for one more person from the public who is in favor of this amendment. Okay, so we have Mike Abdal online. So Mike, if you can unmute yourself and you go ahead and speak. 1 minute, please.
And Mike Abdal online, looks like your hand is raised. You should be able to unmute yourself by clicking on that.
How's that? Is that better?
Yes, thank you.
So what happens when you get old, this new technology stuff. I am in favor of making sure that you guys do the right thing. We have a lot of people that are getting into this fishery now, and lots more coming. The internet plays a big fact in this. Lots of people like to talk. Lots of people like to go fishing, and there's going to be more coming. I was talking to a marine place yesterday that sells boats, and they're sold out for 2 years in advance. That means I couldn't even go there and buy a boat. And I'm a charter boat here in Chatham, Massachusetts, and I've been fishing for striped bass since 1959. So I've been around a little bit. But I just want you to understand that there are more people coming. There's going to be more people working on these fish. So just keep that in mind when you make these rules and regulations to save the fish. Because I was taught without the fish, there is no me. And I would prefer to see the fish. Unfortunately, I have no control over how many people are involved. These people move a lot around. They move from fishery to fishery, from sea bass and fluke to striped bass to tuna. In the last 25 years, it's gone crazy, but in the last 5 years, it's gotten completely outrageous. So keep in mind, 2 years down the line from now, it's probably going to be double what it is right now. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Mike. Appreciate your comments. So we will now look to the public for anyone who's in opposition to this and take up to 2 comments. I'll look to the room first. Is anybody in the room with the public in opposition to this motion you would like to speak to it? There are none in the room. Now looking to online. Anyone online, raise your hand and let us know if you're in opposition to this amendment. And we have Julie Evans. So Julie, go ahead and unmute yourself, and you have 1 minute, Julie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for recognizing me. My name is Captain Julie Evans. I represent the East End fishermen in East Hampton for the Fisheries Advisory Committee. I'd like you to know that we recognize here how important striped bass is to our local economy and not just our local fishermen. You might say that striped bass is the fish that built our economy here in Montauk. I would hope that with all the scientific evidence and all the comments that I've heard, that you would also recognize that you can't go from what I've seen, allowing a generous slot size to going to no slot size to going to no fish, perhaps, but maybe depending on whatever happens in 2023. I am not a person that is in favor of the amendment that says that, this board could move on their own without any public input. I think that public input is very important to our fisheries. And especially on behalf of the local for-hire industry, which is now lumped in with the recreational fishery, this could be devastating to the lives of many people out here, many people out here, not just the fishermen. So, I, as a former commercial striped bass fisherman who lived through the striped bass problems of the 80s, I would like to see that you take all of this in consideration and do your best to maintain the fishery and allow fishermen to fish. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Julie. We have one other person who would like to speak in opposition online, and his name is TJ Karbowski. So, Mr. Karbowski, if you could unmute your microphone.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, I mean, this is all with good intention, don't get me wrong, but there's just so much uncertainty, specifically in regards to the MRIP data. We have zero confidence, it's been brought up earlier, but we have zero confidence in MRIP data for every other species. And I don't know why we're taking this as gospel for this species. Also with the gentleman Mike there, the mathematician guy who did the presentation earlier, I believe all of his math for the percentage of the rebuilding was based on the higher MRIP numbers. And I understand if it's based on higher for one example, but it either should be also included if for the lower end of the spread, or maybe split the difference, just like everything else, whenever you're negotiating anything. And then finally, I spent half my life fighting for black sea bass regulations. You're 200 and something % over the target, and you guys are still trying to take the fish away. So even if we hit this magical number, which we're never going to hit, of the 1995 whatever biomass level or the SSB, we're never going to hit it anyway. But even if we did, you're still going to be taking stuff away. I mean, it's just restriction after restriction. So that's why I don't support it. Not because it's not with good intent, but anytime you guys ever do anything, it's take, and you never give it back. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Karbowski. Appreciate your time on the microphone. All right, so we're back to the discussion of this amendment, and hopefully we'll entertain a couple of more comments. And if not, we'll put it out to a vote. Tom, I think you had your hand, you did have your hand up at the last moment, but you still interested in talking about this one, or you want to go back to the original motion?
Yeah, I already talked about this one, that I didn't support it. So
okay, let's
go
hold
back
that.
to the original.
All right, let's hold there. Anybody else? Dave Sikorsky.
Thank you, Marty. I would have more to say once we dispense with this, but in regard to the public opportunity for public engagement, I just want to say from my perspective, we have 365 days a year to engage in fisheries, and that's unlike ever before in history. And I want everybody to recognize that and remember that not just to the public, you have an opportunity in every state capital, which is represented around this table, pardon me, to engage with your managers, to engage with leadership, and to try and craft that future for your fisheries. So what I see this is a proactive tool, not to cut out public involvement, because I fully support it. I mean, I work for a fisheries nonprofit where my job is to get the public engaged in this process. So I fully support the public process. And my point is, get involved yesterday, get involved tomorrow, get involved every single day, not just when this board meets, because if you're simply just providing us input when this board meets, you're too late. And I do have faith that the folks around this table can handle this responsibility and act quickly with TC guidance. So that's why I'm supportive of this motion to amend. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dave. I'll look one last time, especially if somebody has not commented yet. Does anybody else have any other comments before we take this to a vote? All right, then I would ask, do we need a couple of minutes for a quorum, or? Okay, is 2 minutes sufficient? Okay, 2 minutes. All right, we'll go ahead and call the question. All right, folks, we'll go ahead and call the question. All in favor of the motion, please raise your hands. And please keep them up.
Rhode Island, Massachusetts,
Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Fish and Wildlife Service, NOAA Fisheries, Pennsylvania, this is harder, North Carolina, Maryland, Virginia, Delaware, Maine, New Hampshire, and Potomac River Fisheries Commission. And DC. Sorry, it's very hard for line.
We got you, Danny. I had you. So, all right. All opposed, raise your hands. There are none. The motion passes. Is there any abstentions? So the motion passes unanimously. So now we'll have the amended version of the motion. Do we need to get staff to incorporate that? So we're back to that. All right, thank you, staff. We're back to the motion, and I do want to acknowledge we did see one member of the public who had his hand raised. I just want to clarify that we were only taking up to 2 comments for and against, but there will be another opportunity before we vote on this motion. So I'll go back to the board. Is there any additional discussion on this main motion? Tom Foti.
When we started going down this path a couple of years ago, I basically talked about the fact of how we rebuilt the stock store in the 80s. What we did was protect the 82-year class by raising the size limit every year to make sure they were protected till they spawned at least once. And 95% of the population spawned it once. And so over the years, because I knew I had to go before the legislature to get those bills passed, so New Jersey stayed in compliance every year, because that was the goal. When we first started doing this, you implemented a slot, and some of us sitting around the table said, this is not what we should be doing. We should be if you want to really protect it, you should be protecting the 2015, maybe the 2018 year class. And I've always felt that those fish show up every year, unlike the big fish that show up maybe once every 2 or once every 3 years. And they all are feisty females and feisty males that really attack each other and have a lot of sex, and they produce a lot of babies. And I'll be kind of blunt about this, but we basically did not do that. We put a slot limit that would eventually move us in and put us in this predicament. I knew it was going to happen because there was too many fish moving forward. So I would like, as an option, and I'm not going to ask for an amendment, but as an option, as we're doing a discussion of what we should send out to the public, is looking at doing that instead of going the opposite way. Because I think, the bigger fish also, when you target them and you basically release them, or you basically get them on the line, the 28 to 35 will basically survive better than the bigger fish because it takes longer time. They build up more lactic acid. The water is warm. They will basically die faster than the smaller fish who basically will survive, especially the 34, 32, 33-inch fish. So we should be having that as an option when we go out to public hearing. That's all. And as I said, I support all the speakers what they said. As long as the other last motion, I would have supported it. I did support it because it was an option, and that's why I'm looking at this as an option to go into the public hearing document that we turn out to the public. And again, as I said before, I don't want to do any knee-jerk reaction because I've gotten slapped across the face over the years by have to go to my legislature, because that's when we used to have to do it by legislation to change the bill the next 2 years. Matter of fact, it got so bad that Maureen in charge of the committee, and she wouldn't hear the bill. I said, we better be out of compliance. She said, I don't care. We're not hearing the bill. So I had to go to the Veterans Committee because I knew the head of the Veterans. I had heard it in the Assembly in the Veterans Committee, a striped bass hearing. The first and only time that ever happened. So, yeah, I mean, also my concerns if we start doing anything else but this, we're going to wind up a lot of people going out of compliance just because of timelines and everything that's involved, and because some like New Jersey Marine Fisheries Council is so upset out of a scub, and I come in with this thing, they're going to look at us like we're crazy. So I'll leave it at that at this time.
All right, thank you, Tom. Over to Mike Luisi.
Yeah, thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I made comments earlier regarding the previously underlying motion about the possibility of considering adding some language here which speaks to what's been brought up many times before and was highlighted through Mr. Celestino's presentation regarding discard mortality and where we might go with that. Understanding that this board has made comments over the years about the importance of discards and the degree for which discards play a role in the overall mortality on this fishery. However, given the comments that I've heard around the table, and understanding that in order for this board and the commission to put forth the effort to get rules in place by 2024, which I believe is critical at this point, I've decided that I think at this point right now, moving forward, based on the comments that I've heard, that I will fully support this motion as before us. But I do want to highlight and reiterate the fact that any follow-up motion, as it was mentioned earlier, follow-up actions as a result of an assessment update, I would hope that this board would consider exploring the concept of reducing dead discards. And, you know, the one thing that I've mentioned before, we've implemented in our state is a non-targeting style rule. And I know that there's difficulty with enforcement on that rule. There are challenges. And however, I would say that, you know, if you know that you're based on quality and water quality, air temperatures, and whatever else may be a factor in the fishery that you're managing, if you know that there's a time of the year when these large fish, which we're now likely to be protecting through adjustments to the slot, you know, by protecting those fish, by reducing the slot limit, in my opinion, we're just going to see more fish caught and released. And, you know, whether or not that offsets one another, hopefully not. Hopefully we're making the right decision by adjusting on harvest at this point only. I just think that states should start looking into when they know the conditions are not ideal, and whether, you know, maybe not even to get credit for the reduction, but if you know the conditions are not ideal, maybe a regulation or a rule in place to try to limit that amount of dead throwbacks would be something to consider moving forward. So I hope that with my comments and others that have spoken regarding this, that there's a commitment by the board to exploring that in a future action. But I'm going to leave that off the table for right now, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mike. All very good points, well taken. I know we're getting close. Are there any other additional comments? And John, I know I'll go to you in a second, but I'm trying to balance to give everybody a fair chance here. Is anybody who's not provided comments you would like to make a comment at the board? I'm also going to go back to the public, as I mentioned, before we vote. Any others? So go ahead, John, you've got it.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'm sorry. It's just more from being a fisheries regulatory bureaucrat. That word in the potential measures should include maximum size limits. Would it take an amendment to change should to may? Because, as I said, I'm just one of those things where if it says should include maximum size limits for the commercial fishery, there's going to be a push to have those. And as I said, I just think that's very problematic, especially for a lot of our ITQ fisheries where they're using gill nets. I think it would actually increase discarding rather than serve the purpose that we want. I think there's other ways to manage the commercial fishery to get better reporting. Just a suggestion.
Bob, can you help us with this?
Not sure I can help, but to answer one question, if you wanted to change a word in there at this point, it would take a motion to amend. But you know, I think keep in mind what this motion really is. It's a direction to initiate an addendum, then a series of things that the plan development team is going to weave into a document that will come back to this board before public comment happens. So, you know, it just because, you know, I think there's a lot of steps in this process before anything actually becomes reality. The board can pull things out and modify them at the next, you know, when they see this draft addendum and other times. So in sort of the idea of moving things along today, you know, just keep in mind there are multiple chances that revisions as this moves forward.
Thank you, Bob. So John, if you feel so compelled.
based on what Bob just said, I'll just leave it alone then. I just wanted to get it on the record, though. Thank you.
All right, thank you. And Dave Sikorsky, you have the last word.
Thanks, Marty. The more about it with Mike, I still have some concerns, but I'm not going to attempt to amend this in any way, shape, or form. I want to move forward and vote as we should. I think it's important to notice that, as John's comments about the commercial fishery, we're really just limiting the portion of the stock available to the commercial gear. And from a Chesapeake perspective, that does not provide any conservation really. And that's a challenge for me. I think I have continued heartburn with the idea that Maryland, the Potomac, are fishing on addendum 4 quota levels. So we didn't even attempt to reduce quota, 1.8% is what it was reduced on paper through addendum 6. So there's still a fishing mortality being persecuted against the fish in the Chesapeake that is at addendum 4 levels. If you just think of the commercial component of fishing mortality in the Chesapeake. Now you add 4 years in a row of poor recruitment, and unfortunately we think maybe a 5th coming. We still have work to be done in the Chesapeake. I continue to look at the projections that the TC has provided us, and I see that downturn that's starting to happen. And that's where my perspective is I'm very concerned about that. And so I don't want to open this up and attempt to reduce quota at this point, but this challenge still remains for all of us to rebuild this fishery well into the future. Thank you. And all sources of F should be considered.
All right, thank you, Dave. Max, did you have your hand up? I might have missed you.
Yeah, just quickly, a couple of comments that I heard. I want to comment in support of the motion, but also the initial intent, I think I heard from the maker, to keep this simple. And I think that's really important with the 2024 assessment right around the corner. I think the complexity of an addendum is critical to allowing the board to act quickly and get new measures in place for 2024. So I just want to speak in support of that intent. Thanks.
Thank you, Max. So before we call the question, I'd like to go ahead and go to the public to comment. 2 in favor, again, 2 opposed. So we'll start with in favor, and we'll look to the audience first here in the room to see if anybody would like to speak in favor of this motion. Seeing none, we're now asking on the webinar if you'd like to comment in favor of this motion, please raise your hand. All right, Michael Woods, would you like to speak to the motion? Unmute your microphone and please keep your comments to 1 minute if you could, please.
And Michael Woods, looks like your microphone is unmuted, but we cannot hear you. So you can.
I apologize. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, my name is Michael Woods. I am commenting on behalf of backcountry hunters and anglers, and specifically the New England, New York, New Jersey, Capital Region, Pennsylvania, and North Carolina chapters, and our members from those regions, really all across the striped bass's range. I wanted to comment in support and mention a couple things. The first of them is that back when we considered Amendment 7, all of our members advocated basically to recover the fishery by 2029. And I know there was a lot of discussion about abundance metrics and things of that nature, different ways that we can address this. But ultimately what the board opted to do was to rebuild by 2029 to that target level. And this motion really would put that recovery into action. We think that it's needed. The data clearly indicates that that additional measures are necessary. And so we would urge the board to put this forward and take those measures and uphold its obligation to recover by 2029. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And we have one other person in the public, Michael Abdow. Go ahead and unmute yourself. And again, one minute, Michael.
All right, Mike Abdow. I live up here in Cape Cod and Chatham, and the commercial aspect of it, I've been doing my whole life, and I've been fighting for it for 40 or 50 years now. Keep it running. People want to eat fish. Not everybody goes fishing. I would see a problem if you were to put a slot limit in. Let's just say, I'm just using this example, 35 to 45 inch fish. People here still use gaffs, and maybe in the water, a 46 or a 47 inch fish might look like a 45. And once you start doing that, we now have a discard rate bigger than what it is from just letting them go on purpose. So I just want you to think of that when you go and do this. I know somebody else brought this up too about discards, and I would rather not see the fish get wasted. I mean, if I don't know how you're going to do that, how you would do it. As a commercial fisherman, it would be pretty tough for me, especially when you're fishing at night in a boat in the ocean, mile or two offshore in a rip. Especially up here, we have.
If you could finish up.
I'm sorry.
It's okay. Just real quick, finish up. You're in favor of this motion?
I am.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. We'll now look for two members of the public who are in opposition to this motion. I'll look to the room first to see if anyone is in opposition to this motion. Seeing none, we'll go to the webinar. If you are in opposition to this motion, please raise your hands. Michael Peary, if you could unmute yourself, and you have 1 minute. Go ahead, Michael.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I don't think we proved an emergency today. I don't think we should be taking action today. I think that I'm very disappointed that I found out about this meeting through back channels and nothing was published on websites, the AMFFC website, anywhere. It was by chance that I found this, and this is a very big action to take without public comment. I don't believe in MRIP, which is producing the 2022 harvest level. It could be 1 year outlier, and this is a lot of action to take with uncertainty. That being said, the monster in the room is catch and release mortality. Instead of limiting harvest, we should be focusing on that. It is more than 50% of the fish death. Please consider fish mortality over reducing harvest. Thank you.
Thanks, sir. And we have no others, so we're going to go ahead and call the question. Oh, before we do that, I'm assuming we need a couple minutes to caucus? 3 minutes? 2 minutes? 1 minute? Let's go 2 minutes for caucus. All right, the motion is move to initiate an addendum to implement commercial and recreational measures for the ocean and Chesapeake Bay fisheries in 2024 that in aggregate are projected to achieve F target from the 2022 stock assessment update. F equals 0.17. Potential measures for ocean recreational fisheries should include modifications to the addendum 6 standard slot limit of 28 to 35 inches with harvest season closures as secondary non-preferred option. Potential measures for Chesapeake Bay recreational fisheries, ocean and bay commercial fisheries should include maximum size limits. The addendum will include an option for a provision enabling the board to respond via board action to the results of the upcoming stock assessment updates currently scheduled for 2024 and 2026. If the stock is not projected to rebuild by 2029 with a greater probability than or equal to 50%. All right. We'll look to the board. All of those in favor of this motion, please raise your hand.
Potomac River Fisheries Commission, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Fish and Wildlife Service, NOAA Fisheries, Penn, North Carolina, Virginia, DC, Maryland, Delaware, Maine, and New Hampshire.
It's unanimous. Motion passes. So what I'd like to do now is take a well-deserved 5-minute break. We'll set the timer. Please come back.